So I need just an extra moment to go through all of Charles Austin Cropper's degrees. He is, as you probably know by now, a self-employed physician, board certified in occupational medicine. What you might not know is that before practicing medicine, he was trained with degrees in computer science with skills in cryptography and information security theory. He has an MS in computer science from Texas A&M, an MBA from the University of Texas, an MPH in epidemiology from the University of Texas, and an MD from the University of Texas. So with all of those degrees, he has synthesized a very interesting and participatory talk that I'm looking forward to very much. And without further ado.
Okay, yes, so I am an occupational physician, and this is my talk. I usually go by my middle name. You can call me Austin, but if you're looking, as you should always do when you get interactive with doctors, you really need to investigate who you go to, because some people aren't exactly who they say. Disclosures, this is an interesting thing that we really should all do, and the MDs are getting more into this because we're figuring out that biases permeate everything that we do. And these are my disclosures. I have received no monies from Nanomaterials. Before I go much further, though, I want everybody to prepare with a pad of paper and a pen. You will mechanically need to do what I'm about to ask you to do. The next two slides that you see after this objectives are unrelated to the talk. They're a little bit of history about occupational medicine, and they're designed to give you something to look at after you've answered the questions at hand that I'm going to pose to you. The purpose of the talk that I'm going to go into here is essentially, I'm a member of the International Commission on Occupational Health. I was asked by Dr. Eggleston to look into these aspects of human health and nanomaterials. I inquired with the Committee of Epidemiology in the International Commission, as well as the American College of Occupational Environmental Medicine. Is there any human health data on nanomaterials? Well, there really wasn't any, which I don't think is too surprising to people. So what I did is I decided to pick a very ancient occupational environmental illness and tie it to a lot of the discussions we've been having. And I've actually been very well prepped from the previous speakers. There are many aspects in the talks that I will use. So with further ado, I'm going to pin somebody to tell me what it is we have in here. I'm going to ask the philosophers, what is this? Just put your hands in, it won't harm you. What is that?
Well, it seems like sand.
It's sand. All right, everybody, write the first three words that come to your mind about sand. Don't think too hard, just write the words down. Give about 30 seconds, write down the words, three words that come to your mind about sand. I'm going to pass this around for everybody.
Texas sand?
Yep, from the Monaghan Sandhills State Park in West Texas. Okay, I see mostly everybody. So the next question is, write down three words for asbestos. The first three words that you come to your mind for asbestos. Excuse me. You will see how this ties in towards the end of the discussion. Of course, interestingly, the first two female physicians on the Harvard Medical School staff were both occupational physicians. So, I chose a substance that since antiquity has been called, it's a scourge, and it's been known to cause disease for centuries. The two forms of allomorphs of crystalline, the two morphs of silicon dioxide that are passing around, one is sand, the other one is glass. And it's interesting, on this side we have a substance that causes severe illness. It's actually been shown for centuries to cause illness. It's been found in the Faroes, and I'm going to discuss that as well as some of the other aspects about it. On this side, the things that we've been drinking out of, our glasses, there are no illnesses really linked to it. And yet, I've realized that later there's actually an interesting physical question of whether this is really a liquid or a solid, whether the glass is like that. I find that that's interesting because this, I think, will underlie some of the questions as we go forward into this question about nanomaterials and other small hazards. 5 micrometers is significant, not because of the material, but because of the human lung and the structure of it. And as I go through these disease processes, you will see that 5 micrometers is where the defenses of the lung are abridged, or essentially where the defenses of the lung can no longer handle this. So, but inside of this, therein lies an interesting question that I can't answer, but I'm going to give you a history about it to see what happens. The other aspect is I want to leave you with more questions than answers with this. So I'm going to read the sign. This is in West Virginia. The Hawks Nest Tunnel disaster, the construction of a nearby tunnel diverting waters of the New River through Gauley Mountain for hydroelectric power, resulted in the state's worst industrial disaster. Silica rock dust caused 109 admitted deaths in mostly black migrant underground workers of 3,000. Later congressional hearings placed the toll of 476 for 1930 to 1935. Tragedy brought recognition of acute silicosis as an occupational lung disease and compensation legislation to protect workers. How many in here have heard of acute silicosis? Okay, that's fairly good. About half the room, a little more than half. It's a very rare condition, extremely fatal, and very recent. Most recent cases I've seen, actually interacted with my professor in West Texas, 2005. It is an alveolar proteinosis. That essentially means that the lung secretes a proteinaceous fluid, but it doesn't cause fibrosis, and that's significant. But here's the clicker. We do not know why this occurs. So if you look at this, it has little fibrosis. Usually it comes from massive exposures of dose. So the classic industry that gets this is sandblasting. The most recent cases I've seen, excuse the feedback, was in tombstone sandblasters, and in West Texas is within standard sandblasters, sandblasting a certain bridge or metal or other thing out. But this is a real illness, and it's highly fatal. The question of why it occurs is unknown. And this is the other form of silicosis at the opposite pole. It's characterized by fibrosis, restriction of the lungs. It takes many years to occur. Many years can be really 20, 30, 40. I think the fastest I've seen this, I've actually seen a case of this, was about 6 years. But it takes much longer than most people would otherwise expect. Again, these associations have all been found in the epidemiologic literature of connection with tuberculosis. In other words, somebody that has chronic silicosis, they're anywhere from 5 to 15-fold higher of developing tuberculosis. And I don't understand why. All of these are unknown whys. So I'm going to stop here for 30 seconds, and I'm asking the audience again for a question. What industries besides sandblasting would you expect to find exposure to crystalline silica dust? Anybody? How in cement? Vermiculite. Well, that's a silicate, so it's a slightly different risk. But what about concrete or cement? Why? The silica is used as a binding agent. It's used in the construction of Portland cement, but when you drill it, it generates a dust. Any other people? Anybody have hardy plank on their house? Hardy plank, siding? Anybody have hardy plank? No, I'm not hearing anybody. Okay. Anybody have standard tiles for roof tiles on your house? I have one person. Be careful cutting that. It's almost pure, in many cases, it's almost pure silica. By the way, in the emphasis with the Hawks Nest tunnel disaster, the tunnel was 98% crystalline silica. So when the tunnel was constructed and the dust that was produced in there, it was so loaded with silica dust that it was actually very dangerous. Anybody guess what occupation caused this very classic chest x-ray for chronic silicosis? Anybody wearing blue jeans in here? Somebody, I know a couple people. This was from somebody that was blasting blue jeans with sand. It was in Turkey in 2008. This is very recent. So my first point, because there's a philosophical question about materials of small size. I want to convince everybody in here that it is possible when you change the size and surface chemistry of a structure that it can lead to toxicity. Do I think that other materials will go down there? I'm a physician. I have no idea. I essentially treat the patients after they come to me. But to me, I consider this highly relevant to this whole question of how do we regulate nanomaterials? How do we come into play with this? How should we do with that? I personally think that the quantum physics of this plays a role, but I'm not. Many people in here are far brighter than I am on this subject, and I just think that that comes into play. A previous speaker talked about the spread of crystalline silica versus amorphous silica. I consider that to be highly relevant for this aspect. So the second aspect that I want to talk about is this whole idea of a mechanism of toxicity. And we see this, again, in epidemiologic research. That means that we look at the people that come to us with the illness. We don't know really why. We can see consistently that a dose-response phenomena occurs. If you have a very high level of silica exposure with a very fine particulate dust, you will get very much closer into this realm of acute silicosis. If you have a lower dose, or if you have less freshly fractured silica, or if you have different metals or other atoms connected to the silica, it changes the toxicity. But I find it interesting, if you look at the second quote, and I want to read it, the chemical and surface properties, including sorption, oxidation, reduction reactions, and charge, also play an important role in biopersistence, cellular responses, and pathogenicity. That's almost like some of the story tales we're hearing about nanomaterials. But this is actually with silica. This is a confirmed aspect. Again, I find this very a premonition of where this could happen. It may not happen, but we have no idea why crystalline silica does this. And we've essentially studied this for centuries. It's very interesting from that point of view. And when I was in a previous conference with the nanomaterials, they were talking about this aspect of looking at nanomaterials and what to do with the nanomaterials. I threw up my hands and say, we don't even understand how crystalline silica causes silicosis. And yet we're going to study these new materials where we barely know how to commercialize them. That's an interesting question that comes into play. Interestingly, the numbers, I've neglected to mention this on this previous, there were 157 subjects in Turkey that had that were doing the sandblasting. 68 of them were diagnosed with silicosis. The average age at diagnosis was 23. You can see that that imposes a huge burden on society, and we, as scientists, do not understand the mechanism. So this is my second point. We can study these things for essentially centuries and still not come up with the question at hand. When I interact with my colleagues in the legal world, I'm often reminded by a discussion that's made, not making a decision is a decision. And when we think about the aspects of what we're doing, whether it's engineering the sheets of nanotubes or putting catalysts or other materials, please realize that at some point, everything will become a natural experiment. We will put these things into where the environment is going to reveal the true test. Other humans are going to reveal the true test, whether it's the workers, the users, and that's a very interesting aspect to think about. And yet, when you spend all this time, you may never find the answer. So that's my second point. The third one is actually the one that I really, really, really want to harp on. Who in here, let's go back to the questions. I'm going to randomly pick somebody. What was the first word you wrote for sand?
Beach.
Who else wrote beach? Lots of people. Okay, what was the second word you wrote for sand? Oh, second word. Okay, so what was your first word? What was your first word? Gritty. Okay. Did anybody say cancer? Did anybody say deadly? Did anybody say anything along this line? Fibrosis. One person said fibrosis. Okay. Let's pick, I'll pick on Chuck over here. What did you write for asbestos? Mesothelioma. Interesting. What did you write for asbestos? Pipes. Insulation. Okay, what did you write for asbestos? Dangerous. Which of the two substances, asbestos or silica, has caused more disability and more death in the last 100 years? Silica, by far. There's no question about it. Therein lies an interesting social question. Why do we approach these two things very differently? Because they impose a very different burden on our society. For some reason, asbestos carries with it a very heavy social facet that is not carried in with silica and sand. Therein lies an interesting aspect that I don't understand, but yet I see this as a practicing doctor all the time. And in terms of years life lost, they've had hundreds of these studies, but I tried to find one that really summarized it. I do have tables later to discuss it, but suffice it to say, the years of life lost are higher generally for silicosis because it affects people that are younger. And so there's a higher burden placed because of that. So, excuse me a second here. On the bottom, you will see a reference, and all my slides have the references to it, but I want everybody to be aware of that reference because I really challenge you to go read it, because this will frighten many of you from an aspect. I want to read a quote out of it. Let me put the preface in it. This study essentially it was a prospective design study of 255 physicians at one of the North Carolina medical schools. The hypothesis was this: a high hostility score on a standardized personality test, which was the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, predicted cardiac death and all death 25 years later. They took this, and I want to read it from what they said. Routine examination of hostility scores for deceased subjects revealed that they predict subsequent mortality from all causes. All causes include suicides, violent death, and other diseases, heart disease, etc. The reason I challenge everybody in here to look at this, because now you're picking a pure psychologic and social variable, and yet it's highly predictive of how someone will proceed with their life. We very rarely integrate this with our bioscientific model. I've been disciplined with this, especially as a practicing doctor. Again, I will have two workers come in, and your email was very instructive. One person will come in, they will say that substance X is poisoning them. But when you look at the variables, do they like their job? Do they hate their supervisor? All these, do they hate their job, hate their supervisor? What is their home life? And was there some previous psychological influence on their life? Versus another worker in the same work site that loves his job, loves his supervisor, has a good home life, and was never abused as a child, something like that. The worker that has these social variables, much lower risk of death, much lower risk of developing cardiac disease, much lower risk of becoming disabled. We do not control for these variables very well in our studies, and yet they predict time and time again, in my experience especially, which worker I'm going to have a problem with in the future. And it's totally unrelated to the underlying toxicant in hand. In terms of, before I forget, we mentioned somebody about catalysts in here. And this is from my point of view of things that we should pay attention to. We look at the substances in nanomaterials, but we fail to neglect these other things that I've mentioned, the yttrium catalysts and the other things. Those are aspects that I really think should also be paid attention to, because when they're forgotten, they can create an interesting how should I say this, carriage effect, much like the psychological aspects are not carried into, and then we discover later that they had more influence than what we imagined. So, here's my third point. Non-biomedical variables highly affect the outcome. If the risk that a person is exposed to is involuntary, is not familiar, is man-made, has catastrophic potential, that creates a situation where it's like a boiler situation where you cannot get around it very easily. Essentially, the person, whether it's the worker, it's usually a worker because they're the guinea pigs with many of these things. They are put in an involuntary sense, exposed with different materials. They are in it because they want to earn a living, and so there's another pressure on there. You put all those into situations like this, and then you throw in the social pressures, such as the husband or wife needs to feed for the child, etc. These can overwhelm the actual toxicity. The word actual is improper. The toxicity that is perceived or believed to be there from the scientific literature may be much worse because of these factors. That's the third point that I want to stress. So, in my conclusion, there are these 3 points, and I want to leave it to these 3 points. The structure and size changes can affect the toxicity. I had a discussion about whether this is a philosophical question that's relevant or not. Please consider that with silicosis, that you consider that a risk. I'm not saying it will pan out like that, but please consider that. The second aspect is there are facets of the illness, whether it's causation or mechanism, that will be studied for centuries, and we may never know what it is. We really have to know something, so we are usually drug into a wall and we make decisions. Now, if you have mechanisms to address these, we will gladly love you to death. And I go through all the different literature that I can to try to not be pushed into a wall where I have to tell people it's not known. But I'm surprised at how often I have to be pushed into that situation. And the third is to realize that we live in a culture and an environment that that's around us, that's not just us alone. We live around other people, our families, and all these forces interact and can raise and lower the risk of illness and disease in ways that are often very hidden, but they are very real. And I want to end with this statement that was attributed to Aristotle, because as I've been growing into being a practicing physician, this is something that I'm seeing in many other colleagues that they do not do. And I think it's very, very, very important, because when you omit the second step, you're lost. So that's a philosophical statement, but I just believe this from my very deep heart. So I realize this talk was short, but I wanted to open it up for questions, and I had people planted around with questions that I know I didn't address that I want to bring forth. I have all the literature articles, so. Microphone.
Social effects, is that not something similar to a negative or inverse placebo effect?
It's very hard to test for it from that point of view, because it could be that way. There could be that's the nocebo effect that you're referencing, and it's the literature on describing the nocebo effect is very thin, but it's highly possible. It's been, when you look at even the literature on the placebo effect per se, it's also gotten much harder to interpret because of our rigorous nature of studies that we've gotten. But it's possible that it could be that.
Well, I guess my question is, hearing all this and hearing what's being done in nano-EHS, does it worry some of the people in the room that we're spending all these millions on nano-EHS compared to what is being spent on understanding the causes of silicosis, and yet we see so much more damage done by the latter? I mean, should we be reassessing where our resources are going? Is that an ethical question that we ought to think about?
I think that's a social question, but this is the most recent aggregation of data from NIOSH that I could get on the mortality from silicosis, and it goes back to '68. But you can easily impute that the trend keeps going up all the way back to 1900. And if you look at the scales on the left, the number of deaths on it, I will tell you right now, this is underreported because many physicians do not recognize silicosis. It's rare enough that they cannot remember it, they cannot recognize it by rote, and so it's not placed on death certificates. And when you compare that to asbestos, notice the scale. The scale's lower, but these are people. Let's pick 2000. This person was exposed 30, 40 years in the past versus this person that may be dying here. Usually, if you look back at the statistics, it goes back between 10 and 15 years back. So the statistics hide the total amount of burden of disease. And just looking at the numbers, the number for silica is higher overall. So,
I presume the researcher from North Carolina on hostility was Redford Williams at Duke. And in any event, since you mentioned that...
It was a man named John C. Barefoot, Grant Delstrom, and Redford Williams.
Redford Williams, yes.
Okay.
He was the lead, I presume. Since very few studies have been done on humans on the nano products, should the design of those include various psychological profiles, the nature of the industry, whether the workers were coerced or felt, involuntarily assuming the risk, because it could definitely affect their outcome and shade the thing. And also, someone this morning said that many toxicological researchers will continue to modify the study until they get a result that shows a toxic effect. So it would be in the interest of the truth, in addition to the progress of this technology, if it is safe, that we show that it's safe. Thank you.
He steps into a lot of areas that are very, because in the United States there are many forces at play. Let's go through the real quick forces at play. The workers' compensation system, which is determined by state law. The Americans with Disabilities Act, which is determined at federal law. This whole aspect of working, meaning I work and earn a living and pay for my children to go to college and pay for my family to live. When you get into these situations of wanting background psychological information, people get very skittish about the collections. I can impute it, and I can work in different workforces to tell you certain basics, but in terms of published studies, they're razor thin. Let me tie it to another point. Many people in this room assume every American can read. I will tell you, having done physical exams on workers in the oil field, that at least 20% of our workforce is functionally illiterate. And so when you ask a question of doing respirator clearances and doing these other aspects, they will read it, they don't understand it. These are functional aspects of what we're doing that we're totally making mistakes on. But I don't have a good answer how to do it. The end run around of the psychological aspects is the better data is coming out of Europe than it is out of the United States, because of their social cultural model allows for a little bit better data collection in that regard, especially in the Netherlands and Belgium and some of the Scandinavian countries. And so I think we're going to find a better answer from those aspects. But then you got to ask the question, well, does that really apply in the United States? Other questions?
Well, I think you're tapping into very broad social phenomena. So we have a lot of good data on the mortality of poor people.
Mm-hmm.
We know a lot about that.
The social determinants.
Would that be a higher priority?
The social determinants, I was telling another person in the room, when you look at the factors that determine how someone will live their lives and what diseases they will get, this is my number that I believe, at least 60 and up to 75% of the factors that determine how we live and die are non-medical factors. They're totally non-medical. They're related to who we marry, where we live, what occupation we chose, the poverty that we live in, and for many people that's a very frightening concept to get around their mind. But the data is there.
To go back to a question and link it to my world, I don't need always and usually need to know why something happens to know a regulatory position. Mm-hmm. Right? I understand the scientists love the why question, but if you tell me silicosis at X concentration of Y size causes the problem, you say, but I don't know why.
And see, I agree with him because
I can regulate.
I make my decisions whether the Y is answered or not. This is where the MDs and the attorneys link up in this point. We just need to know where the hazard begins so we can make the decisions.
And when you think about resource allocation, again, from my world, I prefer to know the what's so I can know what to regulate, up or down, left or right. That's worth more to me than the why, in not all cases, but in a number of cases. So it's an interesting resource allocation question. Short-term, also long-term.
From a point of view that I'm remembering now, because no one's asked this question yet, hemite miners, there was one lady that had the discussion about hemite and the geologic structure of nanomaterials. Believe it or not, depending on what miners mine, whether it's gold, coal, or hemite, raises and lowers the risk of developing silicosis. Hemite actually has a much lower risk than gold mining. Why? I don't know. But the burden is very different. So I'm hoping you have this overlay. But I want some comments about the different perceptions between asbestos and sand and silica, because therein lies a social question that I don't understand, and yet I see it over and over again. We had 4, 5, or 6 presentations where we mentioned asbestos-like, 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 but no one mentions silicosis and sand. And yet I've never seen a case of asbestos disease. I know they're out there, but I have seen 2 cases of silicosis.
So part of the cause probably relates to the fact that you gave very specific circumstances under which silicosis, very specific exposure circumstances necessary for silicosis to occur. Whereas the public discourse about asbestos for years has been, we sprayed it on ships, we put it in roof tiles, we shoved it everywhere, it's all over the place. When you tear out the roof in your house, you're very likely exposing yourself to asbestos and lead, for that matter, depending on when your house was built. So the exposure circumstances for asbestos are much broader and much more likely for an average member of the population than they are for silicosis. Most people don't do sandblasting. Most people don't do mining. Most people do have roof tiles in their home. Most people do work in office buildings, or not most, but a lot of people do work in office buildings that were built, before we outlawed asbestos.
Asbestos has not been outlawed.
Well, not outlawed, sorry, but before we started controlling the way in which asbestos was incorporated into construction materials.
I guess I would disagree with you, and part of the problem is I misrepresented the information. Silica is exposed everywhere. I didn't go through the whole litany of lists, but I've been surprised at the exposures of where silica can be. And when you look at the dosages of the fibers that are found in asbestos when it's abated versus the doses of silica that is exposed with simple things like literally breaking down a wall in a house or breaking down, there's actually silica in many of these things that we don't really realize is there. There is actually somehow a societal perception of risk that is systemically different between these two, even though the exposures for one is much more common than the other. I realize what you're saying about vermiculite in the homes, the tiles, and all these other things, but my opinion on why asbestos is more sensitive is because people think it was imposed on them more involuntarily, whereas sand is more available in the environment. You can't really get rid of it because it's outside. You can't really, it shows up everywhere.
I don't know. I think it's context. I mean, I'm familiar with a lot of people who work in the glass blowing world, and they refer to it as vermicodeath. I mean, it's very conscious to them that it is a toxic substance, but in the broader public discourse, the difference is in the perception of the specificity of the circumstances under which you can be or have to be exposed in order for a disease to manifest.
I think what a general point we're getting at is that the perception of risk is not rational. And the prime example for women's health, I'm sure you'd agree with, is most women are much more afraid of breast cancer than of heart disease. But my understanding is breast cancer 1 in 8 or 9, heart disease 1 in 2. And so we're worried about the wrong thing. It happens over and over again. Another great example is what happened in terms of travel after 9/11. So many people were afraid of flying that they drove instead and died on the highway. And there have been people, there's an environmental lawyer I know about it at Stanford, Professor Thompson. I'm sure there's many, many others who study the psychology of risk perception. And many analogies have been made at this conference and other nanotech conferences to nuclear reactors when they first came out. And so the average American is more afraid of the new, the unknown, the scary, the science fiction-like element. And so I think that's at work here. On the other hand, there are many scientists and research bodies, again, like the Woodrow Wilson Center, the Penn Project, that would argue that in terms of federal funding for nanotech, we're spending too much on research and not enough on risk and safety analysis. I think we're at 5% for risk funding, and we should be more at 10%. So that's another factor.
Some numbers for that response. 4 cents out of every dollar we spend in the United States or less is on preventive type activities. We in this country are very poor at practicing a prevention approach to everything we do. And so when you say things like that, I agree with you emphatically. We are an entrepreneurial country. We create things and we worry about the aspects later. It's a very interesting phenomenon.